Some feel gluten-free diets are a fad and only those with true celiac disease need to avoid gluten. So let's start about what is gluten. So gluten is really a mixture of proteins, and it's found in many grains. But it's particularly found in wheat, rye, and barley. These proteins are called lectins, and they're present in all plants to some degree. But they are very high, particularly high in grains and legumes. And gluten is probably one of the highest or the most well-known of those proteins. Okay, but not all lectins are bad. There are other subclasses, or two in particular. And two of these subclasses are called prolamines and agglutinins, and they're often referred to as toxic lectins. They're not really toxic, but it's just really to be able to differentiate between the high impact that they can have on a body and then really to those that are fairly harmless. But again, remember that these are all different types of proteins. Now, these toxic lectins are part of plants' natural defense system, and they are defense against predators and pests, and are usually concentrated in the seeds. And yes, grains are considered to be seeds as well as legumes, actually. And they happen to contain these really high amounts of lectins. Of course, in the seeds, the lectins are extremely high. So think about this. The plant is trying to protect the plant species. So it's going to have a lot of defense mechanisms like every creature or living thing on the planet will have. How do we protect the species, right? So to defend themselves, the seeds either deter predators, animals and us humans, by making us ill, or they resist digestion completely, or both. So they either make us feel ill or they avoid how we digest them. And of course, we don't get ill immediately, but they can affect us over time. So how do these things actually affect us as humans, right? So first, they can promote a leaky gut. So when we're digesting foods, there are these very tight junctures in the small intestines where food crosses over and into our bloodstream. And this is where we absorb most of our nutrients. And so lectins and many other things can promote inflammation there at that gut wall. And so it gets to be what we call a leaky gut. Promotes inflammation, and now things that shouldn't go into the bloodstream do. So that's the whole thing around the leaky gut, promoting inflammation throughout the body. Then they can promote an antibody response by the immune system. And I'm sure you understand that whole thing. So we have different antibodies that will react to different things. So we have an IgE antibody, which would be an immediate reaction, and it sometimes can be very life-threatening. IgG and IgA, this can be linked to something like food sensitivities. And then, of course, there's this whole thing about food intolerances where it might be just something in those foods or those lectins, for example, that promotes inflammation but doesn't stimulate the immune's reaction. And then that sometimes can be because we need more digestive enzymes to break down those foods even more, and specifically those grains. Right. The other thing that they can do they disrupt or imbalance our gut bacteria, and they can therefore promote some of the families that are not as healthy to our gut microbiota than, say, someone else's. So they can disrupt or cause dysbiosis in the gut. And then we have something which is also known as gluten cross-reactivity. So cross-reactivity is something like dairy and soy and oats and milk, chocolate and brewer's yeast and rice. This all happens if you actually do have a gluten allergy or intolerance. What it means is that the body is responding to these foods as it would do to other gluten foods. And these are the typical foods we see. We definitely know, for example, that most celiacs or those that have celiac disease probably should not be having dairy because the casein, the protein in the dairy, is very, very similar to the gluten, and they can react in the same way. So again, all of these are kind of immune. So then people say, but what about whole grains? I need to eat those whole grains because they're really important. Whole grain is any grain that uses the entire grain. So that includes the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. So it's true that there's a lot of fiber, vitamins, and minerals. These are all concentrated in the bran and the germ. But so are the lectins. Actually, the lectins are particularly found in the bran. So when people are taking bran supplements or high bran cereals, they're eating a lot of those lectins, right? So if we're thinking about something like, I don't know, or bran flakes, for example, or we're thinking about some of the other cereals that we take, or Fiber One, we're talking about a big dose of lectins there, right, which can promote inflammation. So bran is never a very good form of fiber. So if we were thinking about if you were having whole grain bread or you were having sourdough, from a lectin point of view, you would probably be better off having the sourdough rather than the whole grain. So let's talk about different levels of gluten sensitivity. The most severe sensitivity is called celiac or celiac disease, and there's absolutely no debate about this. There's no controversy about this. If you have been diagnosed with celiac, then you should not be having any gluten. So for those that don't know what celiac is an autoimmune reaction to gluten. So if you eat gluten, you're having a major reaction to this, and a lot of people can end up in the hospital with this, may be very sick for many days with a celiac diagnosis, or even before they're diagnosed. So gluten cannot be had any which way if you have celiac diagnosis. But then there are some people who are not diagnosed with celiac, but also have a gluten sensitivity. These people are often classified as non-celiac gluten sensitivity, NCGS. And actually, NCGS, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, has actually been scientifically validated. And the new term for this, hot off the press, I think, is now termed celiac light. So last week I had a patient that I was consulting with, and she had no celiac diagnosis, but she had an extreme reaction to that any foods that had gluten in it. So for her, she was really on the other side of the spectrum, just under celiac, but really at the top of the non-celiac gluten sensitivity scale. And then other people can just have some other kinds of different reactions. So it's this bell curve. Somewhat reactive to gluten, very reactive to gluten, and then extremely reactive to gluten. So somewhere along that line or that continuum, we can have some kind of reaction to gluten. But the tricky thing about this is, how do we know if we have this? Of course, there's a lot of testing that you can do. And if you have a suspicion that you might have celiac, then there's very definite testing for celiac, and that should definitely be done. There are some other tests that we do, which are known as specialty tests. And you can actually look to see if you have gluten sensitivity for all of those. But the best way to see if you have a problem with gluten is to eliminate it for 6 weeks and then reintroduce it. So it's really about elimination and then reintroduction of that food, and see if you have any kind of reaction. Now, a reaction can differ from one person to the next. You might not feel any digestive reactions, but you might be the person that has a lot of bloating or some pain in your gut or a lot of excessive gas after you've eaten. Or you might be someone that starts to feel a little depressed or some anxiety or some mood fog or brain fog and can't think straight after you've had gluten. You might have someone that has an extreme joint pain. I've seen a lot of patients where we cut out the gluten or they get to cut out the gluten and the pain in their joints subsides. You might be somebody that has some skin issues. For sure, gluten might exacerbate those issues. And if you cut it out and then you bring it back, you might see some changes with that. Certainly hormonal too. So there are so many different ways that we can look at whether you do have that kind of reaction or not. And it's just keeping a food journal and jotting down all the things that happen to you when you're not eating the gluten, but more importantly, when you reintroduce the foods. So the other part too is that anybody that has any of the following symptoms should not be having gluten. So anybody with an autoimmune condition like Hashimoto's or Graves' or MS or arthritis should not have gluten in their diet because it's promoting more inflammation. Any skin conditions, psoriasis, eczema, maybe canker sores, even extreme acne. People with IBS, IBD, Crohn's, UC, cut the gluten. Constipation or diarrhea, anyone, again, with brain fog, depression, maybe even anxiety, good idea to cut the gluten. And if you're trying to lose weight, you're not going to lose weight while eating gluten. So cut the gluten if that is an issue for you or you feel you're gaining weight. And then, of course, there's the pain. If you've got pain anywhere in your body, this would be a very good idea to reduce that inflammation. So if we're thinking about this, dietary gluten can be problematic for many people, and the problems can manifest with differing levels of severity and a wide array of symptoms. And to summarize, determining your relationship to gluten and other food allergens can be very important to improving your own health. So here's the other part I would say. If you change your diet and you still don't see any improvement to whatever's going on with your health, then it might not be gluten and you might be okay eating it. But there might be some other issues going on for you. So if you have no health issues and you feel you are fine with eating gluten, try different types of gluten. So, for example, pasta has a much lower content of gluten. If you're in other places in the world, the gluten levels are going to be different too. If you had to compare the gluten density or composition between United States and Canada, Canada has a much lower level of gluten in their products than we do. Even Italy will have a much lower level of gluten. Ours is a lot higher. So it was interesting. I had a pathologist patient years back, and they were very interested in looking at some of the different grains, where they came from, and how they had been changed over the centuries, right? So they went into Afghanistan and this very remote area up in the mountains in the valley, and they found what was known as, or supposedly, the original wheat, the wheat seed, and they took it back and they did the whole examination around it, and it was completely different to what we eat now. You know, in Norway, they have what is known as the seed bank, and they look at all different types of grains from around the world in different times of their function. And they've noted, and one of the things that they found was that the grains that we eat now is not anything like even our grandparents used to eat. So that whole hybridization and how we've changed the function of those plants can also impact how we are. And our genes haven't caught up with that change, because in that period of time, it's been such a short while for such drastic changes to our food cycle or to our plant, to the way the plants have been reared. So if you change your diet and you don't see any improvement, then there are maybe some other dietary issues going on. And again, folks, gluten is not a problem for everyone. You just have to determine your relationship to gluten and see where you are with that. And as I said, the best way to do it is eliminate it and bring it back out again. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you.